I am the general counsel of the AFL-CIO, and we're the organized labor movement, the one that's down to 12% of the workforce, 8% of the private sector, down from historical levels that were approximately 3 times that size some years ago. Some, including myself, would say we still have disproportionate influence, whether measured by the union advantage that is seen in collective bargaining agreements in terms of the economic benefits that are provided to workers covered by those agreements, or as measured by our continued political and legislative influence affecting state, federal, local legislatures and political campaigns. But surely if our trend continues, that level of influence will be declining as well. Meanwhile, there is another labor movement that has been growing. And it's the labor movement that is loosely speaking, a labor movement of worker centers that are community-based organizations with terrific energy, a lot of momentum, to coin a phrase, and shame on us if the organized labor movement and this new emerging labor movement can't figure out how to collaborate, work together, and take advantage of what both of our movements bring to the plight of low-wage workers in particular. So that's what I want to talk about today. And I'm going to use a very exciting, I think, ongoing community labor campaign, labor standards enforcement campaign, that is been going on involving car wash workers in Los Angeles. So let me first just introduce you to a couple of the workers themselves. The gentleman in the middle is named Feliciano Hernandez. He's 63 years old. He has worked at car washes in the Los Angeles Los Angeles area for more than 40 years. That's not typical. He's seen conditions deteriorate. He says, "We used to get breaks for lunch and to take a rest. I could support my family working in a car wash back then, but no more. Now it seems we just work for hours with no breaks and no water, even on the hottest days, and in the end, the boss shorts our paycheck. Sometimes it's tips only, and sometimes we don't even get paid at all." Another worker pictured there is Silvio Molina, who reports on being routinely exposed to harsh chemicals. He says that he has to buy new shoes every few weeks because the acid burns holes in them. "The skin on my hands is cracked and red all the time. I don't wear gloves when I'm washing cars or cleaning tires because the boss doesn't provide them. Actually, we don't even get drinking water." These trends that these workers describe are obviously typical. They're typical of low-wage workers in all sectors and all across the country. The U.S. Labor Department in the Clinton days did surveys of several low-wage industries, found that there was a 65% non-compliance rate of wage and hour requirements in nursing homes, an even higher, close to 90% non-compliance rate of garment shops, 100% non-compliance in poultry. In a more contained survey that they did in Los Angeles, 37 out of 41 restaurants were in serious non-compliance with wage and hour requirements. Even in the Clinton Department of Labor, when you had better labor enforcement, if the OSHA, all of the OSHA inspectors worked full-time, starting today, and hit your workplace, inspecting your workplace today, it would be 114 years before they would be back to you for the next round. So you can see that there's little wonder that with government enforcement on federal and state levels so inadequate, and with little prospect for that changing in the near term, and with collective bargaining agreements in low-wage sectors in particular being more and more the exception, that the wage gap is growing. And that the CEO worker pay ratio has climbed from a 42-to-1 ratio in 1980 to the truly obscene 364-to-1 ratio that you see there today. Meanwhile, as I mentioned, there is this parallel labor movement that has been emerging. And it's a fascinating movement. To call it a movement is somewhat inaccurate. There are some loose coalitions of day laborers, of interfaith worker organizations, and a couple of others. But these are largely individual community-based advocacy organizations that do a variety of different things on behalf of workers, of non-union workers, ranging from legal service type of representation to dispatching of day laborers, to advocating before state and local legislatures for new standards or for enforcing existing standards. There's a lot of worker rights education, immigrant rights education. Many of these are immigrant-based organizations, ethnic-based organizations, but not exclusively. And little by little, in recent years, the organized labor movement and these organizations have been finding each other. The worker center workers, or at least day laborers, to give you an example, have a 42% wage theft rate. 42% of them experience wage theft. A fifth of them are injured on the job, with a half of those injuries typically not treated. 92% of those workers said they would join a union if they had the opportunity in one recent survey. So in some ways, it's a far cry from workers who are protected by collective bargaining agreements. On the other hand, as you can imagine, to the extent that non-union employers are able to impose working conditions, economic and non-economic conditions on non-union workers, it has an impact on everybody. It brings down labor standards across the board. About 2 years ago, a few of us were offered a tour of day labor street corners in the Los Angeles area. And one of the street corners that I visited was at Agora Hills, a section of Los Angeles, where the day that I got there, a group of workers of about 75, all Latino workers, were turning away the homeowners and small contractors who were coming by in pickup trucks to take them to their daily jobs because they were voting for themselves a minimum wage. And after 2 hours, they had debated and voted a minimum wage for themselves, and they started taking work again, but insisting on the minimum wage being observed. And I went back, I told Steve Greenhouse, who writes on labor and employment issues for the New York Times, he wrote an article about this. And I went back there a few weeks later with some labor leaders from organized labor from around the country. And by coincidence, the day that I was back there, a small group had split off and gone down the street and were undermining their brothers, and they were just brothers, up the street, offering their labor at a couple dollars an hour below the minimum wage. And we were allowed to follow the big group down the street through a combination of friendly and not quite so friendly persuasion. They convinced their brothers to come back into the fold. They heard that, well, we get a free lunch from some of these employers. We should give them a break on the minimum wage and things like that. And they said, look, those may be good arguments, but we should decide that collectively. That shouldn't be a decision that you make unilaterally. And they came up and everything went back to the minimum wage. And I left there that day thinking, this is what a building trades local union in the 1880s was like. There was no legal relationship with the employers. There was no collective bargaining agreement. But the workers collectively were setting standards and enforcing standards and doing something about their plight collectively. And it occurred to me that, again, shame on us if we can't figure out how the organized labor movement that has now had the benefit and the expertise it's developed over the last century and more, we cannot use that expertise, that experience, the legal structures we have, as imperfect and horrible as they are in many respects, the financial resources that we have, at least compared to this group, and we can't figure out how to collaborate with this new emerging labor movement that has so much energy, so much creativity, and community roots that are so critical, I believe, to addressing the plight of low-wage workers. And this led to this and the interaction that many local labor movements were having with worker centers led to a new policy that was adopted by the AFL-CIO 2 years ago exactly, where the Federation voted to allow local worker centers to affiliate with local labor movements, to give them a seat at the table, to let them start collaborating, figuring out where their interests are in common, how to resolve tensions that definitely do exist, and so on. And there's been a lot of progress that's been made over these past 2 years in areas ranging from joint lobbying around state minimum wage levels, dealing with attorneys general on better enforcement techniques, doing worker rights and immigrant rights training together over raids, over other kinds of immigration-related issues, dealing with the very, very common problem of misclassification of employees as so-called independent contractors, taking them out from all labor protections, and other things where there is an awful lot in common. So one of the byproducts of these new relationships has been the Clean Car Wash campaign, the Community Labor Environment Action Network campaign. And what's so interesting about this is that unlike a typical union organizing campaign where unions start to organize and they realize at some point way too late that they need a little bit of street credibility and they go to a community group and ask for their endorsement and it means virtually nothing. This started as a community labor standards enforcement campaign. And it started because a number of worker centers and community groups in Los Angeles recognized that the 7,000 to 10,000 car wash workers, by the way, a fifth of all car washes in the United States are in California, no surprise, and a large proportion of those are in Los Angeles. There are about 430 independent car wash owners. None of the big chains are there. They would not be able to operate on the sub-minimum wage levels that legally, they would not be able to operate there. So you have 450 or so independent operators in this area employing 7,000 to 10,000 car wash workers. They are virtually all immigrants, very, very high percentage of undocumenteds. They have annual earnings that are roughly $12,500, and their conditions are just abysmal. There is virtually universal non-compliance with minimum wage, wage an hour, overtime, health and safety, other minimum labor standards. They are not only paid less than minimum wage, sometimes they are paid tips alone, or as I said before, there is outright wage theft, non-payment entirely. They are typically denied overtime pay, even when they work more than 8 hours or 40 hours a week. They are subjected to health and safety hazards and exposure to toxic chemicals that are abysmal. And there is standard or very common retaliation anytime any car wash worker complains, much less complains collectively, much less talks about forming a union. So the Los Angeles community groups came to recognize that even if they were successful in getting the media spotlight on this situation, and on getting government enforcement agencies in there for a little while, and getting public officials sympathetic, that once that sort of things moved on, that standards would just revert. Once the media lost interest and government agencies moved on to their next industry, standards would just revert. Unless there was an opportunity for an ongoing enforcement mechanism in the workplace in the form of unionization and collective bargaining. A contract that would, as is available to CEOs, would make it possible for workers to negotiate compliance with standards and ideally improvement on those standards. So they approached the AFL-CIO, asked us to find a union that would be willing to partner with them. We have the United Steelworkers, the AFL-CIO, and about 20 community groups, worker centers, ethnic organizations, other community organizations now working on a campaign that was launched just a couple of months ago and that has as a goal a two-part goal. One is to get standards up to minimum legal standards, which, as pathetic as that sounds, would actually be an enormous improvement on their current situation. And then ultimately to get unionization and collective bargaining from which they can start bargaining improvements. How are we planning to do this? Well, we are calling on all car wash owners to enter into clean agreements. And the clean agreement will certify that the car wash owner is committing to do two things. One, to ultimately respect the wishes of a majority of its workers to unionize without opposing that request. And in the meantime, to comply with minimum standards and to submit to third-party monitoring, to give access to books, records in the workplace to a respected third party. And we have the Worker Rights Consortium, which has agreed to be the third-party monitor in Los Angeles, who will ensure that minimum standards are complied with in the meantime. We're doing this through a combination of community pressure. There will be boycotts. We don't think it should be too hard to convince average citizens that there's not a whole lot of brand loyalty out there, that if they have to go 2 blocks down the street to the next car wash, that really isn't asking too much. We're planning to do a lot of wage and hour litigation. We've filed one very high-profile case against one of the more notorious owners so far, and we have a number of law firms that are willing to do pro bono wage and hour lawsuits. We're preparing Cal OSHA health and safety complaints and put pressure on employers to clean up their act that way. And ultimately, when the employers, those employers that do sign and do agree to enter into the clean agreements, we will publicize them just as much as being good employers as the bad ones that we're asking the community to stay away from and that we're litigating against where necessary. And asking the community, to, of course, to be supportive of all of that. Ultimately, we will negotiate collective bargaining agreements, but so as not to put good employers at a competitive disadvantage. We will wait until a certain percentage of the workforce is unionized before asking to bargain contracts that bring the standards up above minimum standards. So I think there are a couple of lessons here that should be kept in mind. One is we need to remember that the union advantage does still exist, and we can't afford as a society and an economy to lose that advantage. There is still a 30% union advantage across the board within industries of unionized employers versus non-union employers, and those differences are even greater when you look at African Americans, Latinos, Asians, women, and this applies, by the way, as well to employer-funded health care, employer-funded pensions, employer-funded disability pay, all of the key fringe benefits as well. So it is critical that we do something to facilitate unionization in low-wage industries in particular. It is a very broken system that we have right now. The companies call all the shots and make it virtually any employer, any well-advised employer that wants to keep a union out has a practically guaranteed opportunity to do that. We are hoping that the next administration will see fit to sign into law the Employee Free Choice Act that will make it easier for those workers, and the latest poll shows that there are some 53% of workers say they would vote for a union tomorrow if they had that opportunity, and a way higher percentage than that say they would if they didn't have to worry about employer retaliation. But finally, more to the point, aside from legislative change, we need to be encouraging and supporting these community labor coalitions. Until the culture itself changes, it doesn't matter if the law changes by itself. Employers will always find new ways around the law. There'll be loopholes. And we need to change the culture itself. And in my opinion, that means having communities recognize that the labor movement is theirs, that unions are part of the community. And I say that as much in recognition that this is something organized labor needs to bear in mind as much as the community groups need to figure out how to take advantage of that. This is a wonderful opportunity. I hope that this will serve as a model in low-wage community labor coalition organizing, and I look forward to working with all of you to make sure that happens. Thank you very much.